Roland, do me a favor.
Uh-huh.
In front of your face, just clap one time for me. Perfect. Thank you. Just makes it easier for us to sync up the cameras later.
Gotcha.
Now you can go ahead.
Okay. In a couple of your interviews, I read about how you discovered comic books, but I wanted you to go ahead and just talk about that story and which comic book it was that started you down the path.
The first comic book I ever read was probably Avengers. I know it was an Avengers, but probably issue one, early 100s. It was a Steve Englehart story, and I can just remember Captain America was on the cover, and I was just entranced by the red, white, and blue colors, and it just it sang to me. But when I took it home and I read it, Captain America was on the operating table for the entire issue. And so he was, but all these other characters were in there, and I didn't know who any of them, I knew Captain America, but I didn't know who any of the other characters were. And I was so upset because Captain America, he was obviously something had happened to him, and all these other characters were worried about him, trying to protect him. So I had to have the next issue. I had to find out what happened. And that was the beginning of my comic book addiction, and it was just something that I did not let go of.
How old were you when you began actually writing comics, and what authors did you draw inspiration from?
I was in the 7th grade when I wrote my first comic. Now, it was probably if you were to look back at it now, it looked like a 7th grader doing it. But it was in junior high and high school when I really began to experiment with the idea of words and pictures together. What was the rest of the question?
What authors did you draw inspiration
Oh, okay, yeah. I was a slow reader as a kid, and so comics are what my mom used to teach me to read. But from comic books then, I went into early science fiction. So some of the writers that influenced me early were Steve Englehart, H.G. Wells, early American classics like Mark Twain. Huckleberry Finn is one of my favorite books. A lot of the Jules Verne, a lot of the old science fiction. Stan Lee, of course, was one of the kings at early Marvel. I loved his work. Steve Gerber. These are the guys that influenced me early on. I didn't know they were influencing me at the time. Of course, I was too young to really associate writers with the content. But as I got older, I looked back on the books that sang out to me and that I really was drawn to, and I found that there were a lot of the same. A lot of them were written by the same writers.
Very cool. How did you break in?
Would you mind putting your foot on?
I would not mind at all. Yeah.
We're trying to widen up the frame. So
Okay.
and,
Yeah, because I talk with my hands a lot, so if I get too
tug on your shirt too.
tuck,
The waist,
tuck,
because it's folding a little bit right through here. So you can just tug it down.
tug down, like that.
Yep. And there's a little bit right under your
On your right hand side.
on your right hand side. There's like a
ripple.
fold. Yeah.
It's this guy.
Mom's got you.
It's this guy right here. It's kind of folding over, so just tug that down. There we go.
Okay. I should have eaten one less piece of pie at Christmas then.
Just aesthetic stuff.
It's not like that.
Okay.
It's sounding good though.
Okay. How did you break into the comic book industry?
I had been submitting proposals to Marvel and DC for a couple of years when I was in college. I was in a creative writing program, and like many who want to be a writer, I had rejection after rejection after rejection. So I was they're beginning to stack up. On a fluke chance, I met a very talented artist as I was kind of wandering around the halls at Southern Mississippi, which is where I went to my undergraduate school. And I saw this beautiful painting of this superhero on the wall, a superhero that I'd never seen before. And, I like to tell myself I was pretty well versed in comics, so I knew most of the characters, but I didn't know that one. And so I asked the guy who lived there. I said, "Well, who drew the character there?" And he said, "Well, I did." And so we began a conversation. To come to find out, he wanted to draw comics, and he had gotten the same amount of rejections from the publishers that I had as a writer. So we just decided that we would do something together because we wanted to. We both wanted to do it, and we weren't having any luck with the big guys. So we would put a project together and then try to sell that to we knew Marvel DC wouldn't be interested in it, but we'd try to sell it to an independent publisher. And, as luck would have it, as soon as I graduated, we sold the story, and it ran for 2 years, and it's kind of what got me into the industry. So it's very good timing on my part.
That was Cat and Mouse?
That was Cat and Mouse, that's right.
Is that a way that you recommend for students to get into it? Do they have to know an artist, or does it make it easier for them?
It makes it a lot easier for them.
Can you go back and rephrase that a little bit more?
Yes. Knowing an artist makes it a lot easier for a writer to break into the industry. You don't have to know one, but the problem is comics are a visual medium. And so if I were to hold up a page of script to you and say, is this any good? You would have to say, I don't know, I have to take it home and read it. But if I hold up a page of art to you and say, does this look good? You would say, oh wow. Immediately you could make a judgment whether I like it or whether I don't like it. And so writers start off with that sort of against them. So if you can team up with an artist, then your chances increase dramatically.
That's awesome. I want to talk about your writing process, starting with the pitch. When you have a new story idea, what's your most successful strategy for pitching it, and who do you pitch it to?
And the way I pitch comic story ideas is in a nutshell, essentially. You have to convince the publisher that your concept is a good one. And of course, your concept has to include a very good character, an interesting character. But one of the problems that I see with pitches amongst young writers, or when I read some things on the internet, is that you don't write the whole thing out. If you've got a graphic novel, don't finish the thing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The main reason is that if you've finished let's say a 90-page graphic novel, well, the editor, if it's completely written, the editor really has, your work is doubled, or if not tripled, if the work is finished and the editor wants to go in and make changes. What you want to do is, the way I've done it, is submit the proposal, like a one-page synopsis of the story, some samples of my scripting, because they'll want to see what you can do. There reaches a point, though, at some part in your career when you really don't have to do that. You just send them a resume and say, here are the books that I've published. It helps to submit a published work so they can see that you've been published as well. I don't submit sample pages of a script any longer unless someone asks, and then I will send it to them. But I would strongly recommend that all writers submit 5 pages of a sample script so that the publisher can see, here's the story. Because story is king. I mean, we teach a lot of things, and of course I teach the character class, and I believe character, strong character is what makes a story. But story is king. If it's not interesting, then I don't care how good you can write. I mean, you can write well a bad story, it still makes it a bad story. And as for who to pitch it to, I think that depends on what you want to do with it. I mean, if you want to write Spider-Man, you can only pitch that to Marvel. If you want to write the next Batman story, you can only pitch that to DC. Some of the other things that come into play are, do you want to own it? Do you want to own the property outright so that you can then take it to Hollywood yourself, or so that you can try to have toys made, or so you can have T-shirts made? A lot of those questions come into play. The further down the list that you go, as far as the publishers, the more control you're going to have, because the smaller publishers are just looking for product to publish. They're not looking to own all of your rights, whereas a larger publisher like a Dark Horse, they'll want to own, because they have a very good tie with Hollywood right now, so they'll want to own everything. So it just depends on what you want to do as the creator of the property. Did I answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, great. What about your pre-writing process? What is it? Do you outline? Do you spend time doing character and world building?
I do very little world building. Okay. My own writing process, I do very little world building, but I do a lot of plot, a lot of outlining, and a lot of character design. Generally, my stories begin with kind of a story concept. I get an idea for what I think might be a very interesting story, and I try to flesh that out a little bit, and then I'll go back and try to decide, okay, what type of character is best suited to tell this story. And of course, I'm big on if anyone in my classes knows, I'm very big on the Myers-Briggs personality type. So then I'll go through and kind of choose a personality type for my character, and that way I can sort of populate the world with other personality types as well. But I'll go from there, and then I'll I'll work on the plot, because I think in comics, we have one page that has X number of panels, so pacing is very important. And the way I think you do that is you start with a small synopsis, build to a bigger synopsis, decide where if you're going to do a serialized version, 22 pages, 24 pages, something like that, you have to kind of decide where your story breaks are. Once you kind of decide where your story breaks are, then you can go in and sort of create your story arcs within those. And so that's kind of the way I work. It's been the most successful way for me.
I'm going to stop you just for a second. Can you give me another clap?
Sure.
Awesome.
I'm getting good at that.
Yeah, professional. So just ask the question that you asked previously. Sorry, you're not going to make
No, that's okay.
Are
Well-
we okay to start?
Yeah, we're
Okay, okay. Once you begin writing a comic book script, what style, such as Marvel, DC, or another one, do you follow?
The two primary styles of writing scripts in the comic book industry are the Marvel style and the DC style, or you would say Marvel's a plot first and the DC is a full script. There are a couple of differences in them. Marvel style has kind of fallen out of favor the last few years, primarily because the DC style, or a full script, once you've written it, you're completely done with it. The writer, you write it. It's a lot like a film script, and where you have all of the action for the artist, and then you have all the dialogue that would go on the page. So once you've written that, you're done. It can go to the editor and the artist or whoever. A Marvel plot first style is simpler, but the writer has to touch it 2 times. And what I mean by that, the first pass, what they do is they write the plot, and so that's all of the action. It contains no dialogue, it contains no captions or thoughts. They might have snippets of it just to kind of give the artist an idea of what is going on in the panel or on the page. But generally, a plot is, for an entire 22-page comic, can be less than 3 pages of text, and it's just page 1, this is what happens, and then the artist takes that and draws based on the action there. Well, the disadvantage for a production standpoint is the publisher has to send copies of those pages, the produced art, back to the writer. The writer then looks at his plot and looks at the pages produced and says, okay, now what text goes on the page? And then they create the captions, the dialogue, any thought bubbles, that kind of thing. So they have to write then the script that goes with it. It adds an extra couple of weeks in production. It adds additional headaches for the editors. My personal opinion is I think if you get an artist who really understands storytelling, visual, the camera and that kind of thing, you can get a really, really nice product. As to what I use, it all depends on the artist. If I know who the artist is and know that they would prefer to have a full script, I can write a full script. If I feel confident that the artist can move the camera, if they can be the director, and do that effectively, then I would prefer to write because it's easier for me as a writer as well. Just say, hey, here's what's happening. You make it look pretty, and then I get to come back and look, decide all the sort of the gloss that goes on top of it. So I prefer that style when given the option.
And kind of goes into the next question here. When writing, do you always know who the artist will be? And if so, do you write things differently depending on their style?
Writers don't always know who the artist is going to be for their project, particularly if you work for bigger companies and you're just writing a script. You generally don't know who it's going to be. So you would make sure that you put in all the information that you want in your script. A poor excuse, it's always a poor excuse to have a writer see the artwork and say, well, this is not what I had intended. But if you look at your script, you say, well, but you didn't put that in there. So writers have to put everything in there. If you know the artist that you're going to work with, yeah, you can cut corners and you can use a language. I have a good friend that I have had the opportunity to work with a couple of times. And so when he and I are doing a project, I often pick up the phone and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking about doing. What do you think about this? And sort of get his feedback. And so often and I say, I don't seem to say this a lot of times, about scripts, comic scripts to artists anyway, is that a lot of times a comic script is like a love letter to the artist, because you write the caption, you write the panel descriptions. No one else is going to read those. I mean, no one. The editor will read it, but all those panel descriptions are read by the writer, the editor, and the artist. Period. That's it. So it really is like a love letter. The artist has to see this and say, all right, I know what you want on this panel. And then all of the other stuff is what the readers see. Did I answer that question?
Yeah.
I feel like I went like this, but okay.
Can you tuck on your shirt again?
Yeah. Is that better?
Yep.
In general, what is your revision process?
My revision process is almost always whatever the editor tells me. Because comics are what they are, I heavily revise early and not late because story is king. So if I can fix all the issues earlier in the plot and in the pacing, once I come to writing the script, all of the kinks should be worked out by then. And at that point in time, it's all done except for when it goes to the editor. Then the editor will spot these issues, and then any kind of revisions are what he tells me to do, or he or she tells me to do. But I work hard on the front end so that I don't have to work as hard on the back end because I hate I don't know anyone who loves revisions. I don't know, we preach them here. We preach them, revise, 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 and I believe in that. But you know, when you're working to sell, when an editor tells you that, hey, this is good, I mean, you don't have to revise.
And is your approach to writing different for creator-owned concepts versus a corporate or company-owned story?
My approach to writing creator-owned concepts as opposed to corporate-owned properties is that I can do with them anything I want to. I don't have to seek approval from corporate offices. One of the funny things about, say, Marvel Comics, one of the things we used to laugh about is that there was kind of a rule that, okay, you can do anything to Spider-Man you want to as long as at the end of the story he's unchanged. And part of that is because Spider-Man has to go to the next guy the same way he is now. Well, my characters aren't like that. The characters that I own, I can do with them anything I want to do. So if I want to kill a guy and leave him dead, that's completely up. Oops, sorry.
That's okay.
If I want to kill a guy, that's completely up to me. I don't have to get anyone's approval. Now, the publisher that I'm working for or the editor or whatever, they may, you know, they may call me on that and say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? You know, we like where this property is. If you do this, you know, and then I'll need to make sure I have a good reason. But the thing with corporate comics, corporate properties, is that you can't do a lot to them. And, you know, that's why sometimes we complain about them a little bit. They get a little stale sometimes. But you'll notice a trick in corporate comics. One of the things that they do, some of the best stories is, even though you can't change Spider-Man, often you can change his support staff, or you can introduce another character. So Spider-Man becomes the vehicle to tell character B's story, and character B then experiences change, which, as we know, as storytellers, change is what makes, you know, conflict and change is what makes for an interesting story. So Spider-Man is the vehicle to tell this character's story so that by the end of the story, Spider-Man hasn't changed, but this character has.
With your work on novel to graphic novel adaptations for The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, that's your, I already mentioned
Yeah.
that before. Didn't make that connection. And The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, what was your approach for adapting these works to a graphic novel format?
Doing adaptations from any medium to comics it can be tricky. Obviously, you're going to do whatever the publisher wants you to do. Specifically for this Huckleberry Finn and Wizard of Oz adaptations, they wanted, which was a little different than other adaptations, because I have done other adaptations, but specifically those two, they wanted the original text, because it's all public domain, they wanted the original text in the book, so that all the words that you see, now you read the script is mine, but all of the words on the page come from the original text. And that was pretty tough to do because, you know, they didn't want a whole lot of editing, and how are you going to get I don't remember how long Huckleberry Finn is, but it's long. How long are you going to get a 400-page Huckleberry Finn into 80 pages of a graphic novel? With some of the tricks that I've done with other stuff, and of course Huckleberry Finn included, you really kind of have to decide what's at the core of the story, and with any novel, some of the things get longer, particularly if you get to older American literature, which I love. You can have, Fenimore Cooper can have 20 pages of Natty Bumppo just wandering through the woods. Well, it doesn't add a lot to your story, so that can be, condensed to one panel. You have to decide as someone doing an adaptation what the important. This is where I think. Remember, I said earlier. I said that doing the work on the front end is the most vital part. Because if you can take the novel and break it down into a plot summary, and then decide what the important parts are, you can then sort of squeeze that into. Well, I've got 10 pages to get in the first 100 pages of this novel, and that creates your challenge. But if you can do that on the front end and know where you need to condense and where you can expand, then I think your task is a lot easier.
And you're going to the comic book editor section.
Okay.
You've been a comic book editor for Malibu and then Marvel Comics. Can you tell us what the job duties are for a comic book editor?
An editor's job is a lot like a production trafficker in advertising. An editor's job is basically to keep the trains on time, make sure the story. Of course, there's corporate editing, and then there's everybody else, right? If you're a corporate editor, your job is to protect the property. If I'm a Spider-Man editor, my job is to protect Spider-Man and make sure that he's not changed dramatically at the end of the story, because then there's a lot of shareholders. There's an executive board who's going to complain, and I'll probably be fired if something like that happens. So that's the first task of a corporate editor, is to make sure you protect the property and keep the trains running. For non-corporate editors, and I don't know that that's a term, but if you're not working for one of the big houses, you're still to keep the trains on time. But the editor's task is to get the most that you can out of the creative. If you're my writer and I'm your editor, obviously you've done something to sell me or the publisher on this concept you have. So it would be my task to get the very best possible out of you. That means if you submit, the synopsis for the first issue, and I say, nothing's happening here, you're going to say, what do you mean nothing's happening here? And then we're going to have an hour-long conversation in which my goal is that you walk away saying, Roland's so right. Why didn't I see this in the first place? Now, this is a brilliant story now. And it was probably already brilliant to begin with. It's just that it often needed tweaking. So an editor has to keep the trains moving on time. It has to get the most he can out of his writers. Often an editor will hire and fire artists. That's the penciler and the inker, the letterer. At Malibu, we had staff coloring, so I never had to hire any coloring. Although that's done in, lots of different publishers will have to do that, but I never had to do that. I've had to hire letterers, but we also had a staff lettering that we just put it into the production chain. We just handled it as production. And one of the key things for any of the major companies is to keep the books on time. And that is one of the hardest things to do, because artists, writers to a certain extent, but artists to a greater extent, miss deadlines. And, unfortunately, we cannot, none of us can stop the clock. The clock keeps ticking, and that month rolls around every single, every 30 days, every 29 days or whatever. So the books have to be out on time, and that's probably the toughest part of the job. The editor is one of the most thankless jobs in comics, because often viewed as the bad guy, but he's really not the bad guy, because, and editors don't want to be, none of them, not that I know of anyway, none of them want to be jerks. None of them, want to be the bad guy that goes and fires a whole creative team. And sometimes, and I've had to do it as well. Sometimes when sales on a property reach this point that borders on cancellation, executives, suits will come and say, okay, Roland, you have to, your book is about to be canceled. You have options. And actually they're not options, but they give you two options. Usually it says fire, get a new creative team, or we're going to cancel the book. So that there's no option. You have to get a new creative team. And that's one of the hardest things to do, is to call your writer and your artist up and say, look, I gotta replace you. It's tough.
In one of your previous interviews, you mentioned a wish that you had an assistant to help deal with the slush pile. Is that one of the duties for an editor? And can you tell us what the slush pile is and what makes this piece stand out from others in the slush
The slush pile is where all the submissions go to an editor. When an editor has his office, of course, with digital, we don't get so much these packages anymore. But at one point in time, everything came in a white or sort of a beige, 8.5 by 11 envelope stuffed with the story in there, or art samples, that kind of thing. Well, you get so many, they just end up stacking up. Most of it is not very good, and that's, I don't know the history behind slush pile, but it's just, there's so much slush there to go through is kind of where what we used to refer to it as. Again, I don't know the history of the term, but I remembered how it felt getting those rejection letters, and I remembered when I would get a handwritten note from an editor, even if it was on the form rejection. I remember the handwritten, "Sorry, this isn't for us." That made all the difference in the world than just getting that form rejection with a stamp on it. Those were just so heartbreaking. And I vowed that whenever I became editor, I wanted to make sure that I had that personal touch. That's hard to do when you get tons and tons of samples every week. So one of the things that I enjoyed doing was turning that over to my assistant editor. And what makes one writer stand out, and we're going to talk about writers because it's easier for an artist, but what makes a writer submission stand out in the slush pile? And it really is simple, but it's follow the rules. You would be surprised at how many people don't read the submission guidelines. When you say, I want a single or double spaced, no longer than 3 pages, I need a summary in it. You'd be surprised the number of people that send you 12 pages of single, this is my short story that I wrote, will you read it and see how it would make a No, that's not what I don't want to do that. So for us, it was often easy to go through the slush pile and just say, all right, nope, 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 nope. Oh, here's one who followed the rules. I'll look at it. So it's just read the submission guidelines and follow those. You'll go from the big slush pile to the smaller slush pile if you can do that.
This may be skipping ahead a little bit, but is that a good way for a writer or artist to break into the industry, is sending stuff to an editor?
Breaking into the industry is one of the hardest things to do. I don't know that submitting work into the submissions editor is the best way. Certainly it's what all of the publishers will tell you to do, and I think you have to follow the rules. I think you have to do those things, but there's nothing that can replace person-to-person contact. You have to get out and meet them, whatever your industry is, and because we're talking comics, you have to go to the comic shows. You have to go to Comic-Con. If you can't go to San Diego Comic-Con, which is the big one in the U.S., go to the Chicago show, go to the New York show, go to the Detroit City MotorCon, I forget what it's called, but there are smaller shows throughout that the editors and various publishers go to. Obviously, the bigger they are, the more publishers you'll find there. So your goal should be to go to the biggest one closest to you that you can, because if I have, as an editor, if I've got 2 samples and both of them have followed the rules, and one of them I met at a show and says, "Hey, Roland, I met you at the Dallas Fantasy Fair. Oh, I remember you, and this one is from somebody I don't know." Well, automatically, this one is elevated slightly, assuming this person was a nice person, they bathed, they were polite, and those kind of things, then they automatically are elevated. Now, the opposite can also be true. If they were rude and obnoxious, they automatically go here. But there's nothing that can replace a face-to-face meeting.
Do you have any specific tips for someone that goes to a convention and is trying to meet an editor or anyone?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you have the opportunity to go to a convention, which again you should do, don't hand them your story. Have a nice conversation with them. Let them know you're a cool person. Get to know them. Tell them you've enjoyed some of the work that they've done, and be sincere. At least be familiar with some of their work. You don't have to love it, but tell them you've enjoyed some of it, because they want to know that you know the industry as well. And then tell them what you've done. Tell them some of what you're doing, and ask them. What you want to do is you want to ask them for permission to send them something. Say, look, I've been working on this property, for image, and I'd really like to, I'd really like to submit a Spider-Man story. Are you open to, me sending you something? If you're assuming you're talking to the Spider-Man editor, right? And then the Spider-Man editor, he'll tell you honestly, well, I've got this writer who's contracted for the next 3 years, so no. Or, well, I'm getting ready to change my creative team, so yeah, send me something. Let me see what you got. But don't go and hand them stuff, because they don't have room to take back all the submissions that they gather at a convention. They're not going to keep up with it. It's probably going to get lost by the time they get back to their offices in New York City. And trust me, I know that on a first-hand basis. It's like, well, I know I had like 20 of them. I don't know where they are now. And it's just they've got other things on their mind, because they're there to meet the creative the creators that they work with now. So they want to meet them and eat with them and hang out with them. Their goal often is not to find new talent. So your task is much harder, because they're not looking for you, you're looking for them. And just be nice. That's the thing. Be nice, be polite, and know what you're talking about.
Okay. And this actually brings us back to being an editor again.
Okay.
Your bio stated that you found and promoted new and budding creative talent while you're with Marvel. So I was just wondering if you could tell us more about that process.
One of the things I very much enjoyed while I was an editor is trying to find new talent. And I think part of that passion for me comes because I grew up in Mississippi. There weren't a lot of comic book publishers around. There was zero. I did not want to move to New York. I wasn't really a country boy. I was a rural kid, but I didn't want to go live in New York City. But I wanted to work in comics. And that was one of my frustrations early on, because I enjoyed living where I live, but I wanted to work in an industry that didn't want me to live where I wanted to live. And so when I first started selling comics and attending regional shows, I started attending in New Orleans and in Atlanta and Dallas. I got to discovering that there's a lot of really talented folks in the area who felt like I did. They didn't want to leave Dallas, or they didn't. I don't know that Dallas is that much. Well, yeah, it's a southern city, so it's better. It's still a city. But they didn't want to leave their small town Texas or small town Louisiana. They wanted to stay where they were, but they still had the passion for this medium. And so one of the things I did, because I had established a relationship with a publisher, said, hey, look, I'm meeting a lot of really talented guys. And I became a freelance editor kind of by default. Didn't mean to go there, but I did. And so I started putting these guys together. I would meet a writer and say, hey, look, there's a really talented artist over here. What if we put you two guys together, and we can do a project and we can sell it to this publisher that I know? And so that's how I started finding these guys who wanted to work in comics, but who lived in places like Pineville, Louisiana, or Loosedale, Mississippi, or just in the middle of nowhere. And so that was something that I enjoyed doing.
Can you share your number one pet peeve when working with a writer who's new to the medium?
Oh boy, my number one pet peeve of writers who are breaking into the comic book industry, and that's not knowing what they're talking about. You have to know the industry that you're working in. If you're choosing to work in comics, you have to know, if I mention Jack Kirby, you have to know who he is. Even if you don't like him, you have to know who Jack Kirby is, because you can't work in comics and not know. Now, if you don't know who Jack Kirby is, that's okay, but someone who wants to work in the industry has to know who a Jack Kirby or a Stan Lee or Denny O'Neil. I mean, you just have to know the people. You have to know your industry, because you have to be able to speak the same language. Because when I say to you, I want you to do something in sort of a Kirby flair, well, you have to know what that means. And so, yeah, you got to know the industry. That's my biggest pet peeve, is like, you don't come to me talking about comics when you don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. For the next set of questions, you can choose how you want to answer. If you want to answer it from perspective of both a writer and an editor,
Okay.
or one is a better answer for students to hear. So looking back over your career so far, what single work are you most proud of and why?
I would say the work that I'm going to give you two answers, okay? As a writer, probably the single work that I'm most proud of is probably Cat and Mouse, and for a handful of reasons. The fact that it was optioned by Hollywood is not one of them, although that's a cool thing. I look at Cat and Mouse and I see over the span of 2 years an incredible story arc. Now, if you were to ask me back then, did I really realize I was doing this? No, not completely. I mean, I knew kind of what I was doing, that I was telling the stories as I was telling them, but I didn't realize I was creating a broader arc that I did. And so I look at that now and go, you know, I want to replicate that in the work that I do now. And if you ask me too, like for single stories, what are some of the single story arcs? Probably Cat and Mouse issues 8 through 12 are probably, if you were to ask me to pick 4 or 5 issues that I think are, I would want everyone to go read Roland Mann work, I would point you to Cat and Mouse issues 8 through 12. I think the story in there is intense. The cliffhangers, I'm a big cliffhanger guy. The cliffhangers, you know, for 8, 9, 10, and 11, to this day I can still visualize them in my mind. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of that work, and I look back at it today. As an editor, probably one of the works that I'm most proud of is probably going to be a surprise for anyone who knows my work as editor, but it's probably a series called The Protectors. It was a line of superheroes. R.E. Jones was the writer, but all of the characters were from the Golden Age. They're all public domain, and R.E. took these characters and sort of revamped them and made them modern age, really. The stories that R.A. was able to craft with those characters, I still look back today and say, wow, you know, this is something I wish that more people had seen. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of that.
Is there, if you're working on someone else's concept, is there a title that you haven't had the chance to write for that you would like to?
The one title that I would love to write, and I will say that it's changed a lot in the last couple of years, and so I would probably ignore a lot of what's happened over the last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years. And it is not because of the film, okay? It's because I was a childhood fan of the Avengers. I would love to write the Avengers. The Avengers comic series, you know, from about mid-'70s to about sometime in the late, for about 15 years there in the late 80s, for me is probably the best run of any single comic. Writers like Steve Englehart, Jim Shooter worked on a lot of stories there. Just fantastic stuff. I would love to do some Avengers stories that I'm just dying to tell. And chances of me doing those now are not that great. And here's the neat thing about corporate ideas is that I can actually take those ideas and spin those kind of like what Alan Moore did for The Watchmen. You know, you're aware of that story, right? He wrote these as different characters, as the Charlton characters, and then when DC couldn't do that, they just changed them. They just gave them new names. And so that's probably what will happen to some of the ideas that I've had for that. But I would love to write the Avengers.
Cool. If you could return to a title that you've worked on previously, is there one that you would have more stories that you want to tell?
Yeah, if I could write more stories, I would very quickly write more cat and mouse stories. In fact, I'm actually sort of fishing right now for an artist to do more cat and mouse stories.
And is there anyone in the comics industry that you wish you had had the chance to work with but just haven't had a chance to yet? Or maybe they've passed away?
Yeah, as an editor, I got to know a lot of creators. There are a lot of guys that I got to work with more as an editor than as a writer. There's a lot of really talented artists that I would love to work with, not as an editor but as a writer. Probably at the top of that list would be somebody like Walter Simonson. I think he's just a fantastic storyteller. I mean, he's a good writer in his own, so he probably doesn't really want to work with a whole lot of writers. But I think he's just a fantastic storyteller, and I would love to see him breathe life into a story that I wrote. He's a nice guy, aside from the fact that he's an incredibly nice guy.
Next section, talk about Silverline some.
Okay.
In your career, you made a bold move and became co-founder of Silverline, an independent comic book company. I want to know what made you want to create your own company?
You know, in the middle 90s, there was in the early 90s, there was a comic explosion, and then in the middle 90s, there was a bad implosion. I was an editor at Marvel in '96 when the implosion happened. 400 people lost their jobs at Marvel in the span of 2 days. There were 200 on the East Coast and 200 on the West Coast. Now, I say all that to lead into, I was one of the 200. So after I lost my job, I'd kind of gotten mad at comics because they had really sort of become, I thought of course I was a Marvel editor, so you kind of have to understand this. I thought they had really sort of become sort of corporate driven. And so I was unhappy with the direction I saw a lot of the stories going. And so I moved back to Mississippi, which is my home, and said, you know what, I can do this now. I know what I'm doing. I know how the publishing, as far as the printing aspect of it goes. I already knew the story part, but what I gained when I was an editor at Malibu and Marvel was the sort of production aspect of it from the printing end. And so I returned to Mississippi and said, you know what, I know how to do this. I don't have to have, the budget that Marvel has in order to produce a comic. I can do this on my own and join the ranks of the small press. Plus I had a lot of contacts. I thought I knew a lot of the people in the distribution centers that I thought I would have maybe a leg up. And so that's really kind of what got me to dive into the small press. And of course I did it until early 2000 and just loved it. I will say this though, it's a tough way to go. I was a one-man operation, so what I was trying to do was I wanted to write as well, so I was trying to write the stories, find artists. I was trying to be the editor for them, I was trying to be the marketer for them, I was trying to be the publisher for them, and I had bigger aspirations than I had wallet. And so for me, I think I wanted to put into play all the things that I had learned at Marvel. I still think that if I had deeper pockets or maybe some help, that I might still be doing some of that stuff today.
What about students, say, you've got a writer, they find an artist, and they work on a piece together. What if they're not having much luck with big corporate companies? Would you suggest that they start their own company, or not necessarily looking back?
Yeah, if a writer and an artist team up together, the easiest route for them to go is probably the small press. Marvel and DC, the big corporate comics, they like to kind of hand pick. And they can, because they're the big guys. So what they can do is I always use the analogy of baseball. And you don't have to be a baseball fan to understand it, but I think it kind of helps. Baseball, you have the major leagues, right? Everybody wants to go to the big show. Well, before you get to the major leagues, often players spend years in the minor league. I think there's in Tampa, doesn't Tampa have a baseball team? Does anybody know? Anyway, so, you go to the minor league, you go out of college, you go into the minor leagues, and you spend, you only want to spend, a very little time there because you want the major leagues to see you. And so what happens in the major leagues, somebody gets hurt, somebody gets sick, they need a shortstop. Well, what do? They look in their major league, they look in the minor league teams that they own and say, who's the best shortstop we can have to bring him up? Okay, Marvel and DC, and to a certain extent, maybe Dark Horse, are a lot like that too. They're the major league. That's where everybody goes. They get the pick of who they want. So when they have a hole to fill, they don't usually go to their submissions to look. They look around to see, oh, here's some of these guys down here. Let me see if he wants to do something. Let me see if they want to do something. They'll look and they'll handpick from the minor leagues. So really the best way to get in, even if you want to work in corporate comics, the best way to get in is to spend some time in the minor leagues. Show that you've got the chops. Show that you can produce the material on a regular basis. I'm not going to say monthly because it's hard to do when you're a full-time student or even when you're full-time employed doing something else. It's hard to produce a monthly, but what you have to do is show that you can do it regularly. Show that you can do it regularly and you can have a consistent quality to what you do, and they will begin to take notice. I mean, that's part of the way that I got noticed is the work that I did came out consistently and came out regularly, and it wasn't unusual that when I went to a show, an editor at DC or an editor at Marvel if I stop to say hello to them, they say, "Oh yes, I've seen your work. I'm familiar with it." I mean, that made your head go like this. Of course, they didn't give me work immediately, but the fact that they're paying attention, that's just to me, that is the way to go. If you want to break into comics, start off with the minor leagues. And you don't have to do it yourself. There are a lot of small press publishers that are kind of just one notch above self-publishing, meaning don't expect much, if any, money. But what you want them to do is you want them to get your product out. You want them to get it out and into the hands of the people that they can see. If you get some money out of it, well, then that's a little bit better. But if you don't, that's okay too, because you've got product.
Okay. And you can apply this to artists as well, but what should aspiring writers do as far as, should they brand themselves, or should they be just as well-rounded as they possibly can? Is it best to have, like, mainly write superhero, mainly write historical?
Branding branding writers certainly is a big thing in the publishing industry today, and I'm not sure that I think that works in comics because comics is such a small industry. It's people we love comics, and it's, especially comic geeks. We really love comics, but sometimes it's hard for us to remember how small the industry really is. So I think if a writer wants to work in comics, it's best if you can show your versatility. If you can show that you can do superheroes, but you can also do science fiction. You can also do, Archie comics. Archie's kind of his own genre, I guess. So I think you're better as a writer if you can do that rather than just say I'm only a superhero writer, because I don't know how much superheroes aren't really smiled upon in anybody but corporate comics. Even though we do them, we love them, everyone tries them, they're still kind of frowned upon if it's not a Marvel DC comic. So I think versatility is key.
Okay. Now, last section, the fun questions. For the first one, who's your favorite comic book superhero and why?
Oh, well, I think my favorite superhero comic book has to be Spider-Man. Spider-Man was one of the first characters that I discovered as a kid. And there are a lot of reasons that I like Spider-Man. Some of those are that, he's just an average kid. He's not like the Tony Stark billionaire, has everything. He's an average kid. He was kind of geeky. He has all kind of issues, family issues. He has job issues. The issues that he had were issues that I could relate to. I'm not going to say I was quite as geeky as Peter Parker, but I sort of identified with who Peter Parker was. And I wanted to identify with the powers that he had, because that was this sort of cool escape, sort of portal for Peter Parker that I didn't have. But I think, we look at someone like Spider-Man and someone like Superman. Superman was just so out there. He was an alien. He had all these powers that, who can beat Superman? We never worry about that. And Spider-Man was always getting beat up by the villains. And he would almost always win, but in his fights, he was always getting beat up and had to figure some way out of it. And so Spider-Man was like the everyman, and that's what really drew me to Spider-Man.
And if you could be a superhero, what would your superpower be?
If I could be a superhero and only have one power, I would choose the power of flight. Of course, we might want to say I'd choose the power of Superman, but that's not really a power. I just think flying around would be so cool, to just be able to fly wherever you want to go. There's lots of powers that you could have, and invulnerability might be cool, but I think flight would be the coolest power to have.
Okay. And because of your work with Planet of the Apes, I have to ask, 1968 original or 2001 remake?
Oh, no question, the 1968 original. I still have nightmares about the first shots of the apes from the 1960s Planet of the Apes movie. When the horn blows and we see the apes, I can still see that image clearly in my mind today. Without a question, the very best Planet of the Apes movie ever made.
Can you go back and intro that, so just so we can edit it into?
Do I need to give the whole answer again?
No.
Okay. The question was.
Because of your work with Planet of the Apes,
Yeah.
I had to ask, 1968 original or 2001 remake? That's an awkward one for you
Yeah.
to try to reword.
The original Planet of the Apes or the remake? Without question, the original.
Can you just say, my favorite, man, that is hard to
If I had to
reword.
choose between
Okay,
there you go.
all right.
1968 original
Okay.
or the remake.
If I had to choose between the 1968 original Planet of the Apes or the remake, I would hands down choose the original.
Sure.
Okay.
Not even to- Is that it?
That's it. Thank you.
Very cool.